willkommen allen, die schon im Zoom-Raum sind. Herzlich willkommen zur Veranstaltung Sunrise Movement meets Fridays for Future. Wir geben dem Ganzen mal noch ein paar Sekunden. Es trudeln hier immer noch mehr Leute ein. Schön, Sie alle zu sehen. Mein Name ist Nora Löhle. Ich bin von dem Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung Büro in Washington, D.C. und begrüße Sie ganz herzlich.
Böll Foundation in Washington, D.C. So very warm welcome to everybody waiting already in the Zoom waiting room. We will just hang on a little moment to give the opportunity to everybody to come. So we are going to have an event in English language, but there's a translation into German. So if you want to have translation, you can click on the button interpretation, translation, and you can choose the channel of the language required. If you want to listen in German, you click on German, and if you want to listen in English, you should go on English, but anyway, the complete event will be held in English. So you can ask your questions using the Q&A tool, which is in the middle of the screen. And it would be great if you could tell us where are you coming from, so that we have a chance to know where you came from for today. We've got 60 participants right now, so very welcome to everybody. Friday for Future needs Sunrise Movement. We are very lucky and happy to have this discussion today regarding the subject of climate activism. I'm from the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Washington, D.C. It's a cooperation in our headquarters in Berlin. We are happy to have you from Europe, from United States, and we are going to learn about how the work is done by groups of activists in Germany, in United States. They used a lot of enthusiasm to make climate become a principled subject on the agenda, and both movements are very positive if they have, as soon as they have a look on the politics. So now I wish a very warm welcome to Nora Golden, an expert on climate, on energy. We are happy to have you, and so the floor is yours.
And I'm an advisor at their Berlin-based climate and think tanking consultancy at Delphi. I'm also a climate journalist who writes a column for Internationale Politik and the head of the Washington, D.C. office of the Transatlantic Climate Bridge. As someone who spent a lot of time working on climate issues in both the US and Germany over the last few years, I'm really excited about our panelists today, who represent two of the most important movements in those countries. So I'd like to introduce them now. Joining us from Lüneburg is Helena Marshall. Helena works on strategy, campaigns, and fundraising for Fridays for Future Germany. I saw there was someone else from Lüneburg in the chat, maybe even two people. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is Lauren Manus. Lauren is Advocacy Director for Sunrise Movement USA. And I could tell you a lot more about their accomplishments and activism, but we all want to hear from them directly. So let's get started with the conversation. Lauren, you're up first, and I have a big three-part question for you. Where are you from? How are climate impacts already affecting your hometown? And what was your motivation for getting into activism?
Great. Could talk for hours about this. Love sharing stories about how we enter the movement. I think that's like one of the most grounding things across all, place and generation. But yeah, really glad to be here. Like Noah said, my name's Lauren. I currently live in Washington, D.C., but I grew up in South Florida, pretty close to the Atlantic Ocean. And from a very young age, I think I was maybe 8 years old when we had back-to-back hurricanes of really, really strong hurricanes. And I was just excited because I didn't have to go to school for a month. And then I got back to school and I realized so starkly the kind of how climate impacts and exacerbates already existing environmental injustices. And, I was just excited to go back, not have to go to school. I didn't even realize that most of my classmates lost their homes, parents lost their jobs, and it completely changed their lives. And so that was when I was 8, and I was like, okay, this problem. And then learned that basically all of my politicians representing me at the local level, state level, federal level, took money from fossil fuel executives, were actually voting in ways that were worsening the climate crisis every year, and got pretty angry and feeling not represented. And yeah, started putting the pieces together and realized kind of the strongest, most powerful way to tackle the crisis, both the political change and the kind of scientific existential crisis, was through organizing and movement building. So that's kind of how I got involved, just like starting to look around me, understand power, and then understand that we need to build the power to actually change things. So yeah.
Really interesting background. I used to love missing school for snow days too, but we don't have quite as many of those anymore. Helena, same question. Where are you from? How are climate impacts there, and why'd you get started?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Germany. I was born here, but I grew up in the UK and also in the US. I lived on the East Coast, on Cape Cod, which is also right on the ocean. And my parents are scientists, they're geologists. And I was kind of always hanging out with all the scientist friends. There were people studying like corals and ocean acidification and like atmospheric developments. And then I was right on the beach, and we had obviously stronger hurricanes, and we also had the like record coldest winter while I was living in the US, with the Atlantic Ocean freezing over. We went like on a walk on the ocean, which was really cool, but also quite worrying because I was pretty sure that's not the way it's supposed to be. And then obviously all those scientists kind of studying the scientific side of this made me really, really aware of the climate crisis from quite a young age. But I always thought that, first of all, I was much too like little to change anything. And second of all, the adults would like deal with it before I got older. And then I moved back to Germany like 5 years ago, and I became like increasingly disillusioned with politics and also with the climate crisis, and like very frustrated because I could see it kind of getting worse and worse. And I read like the IPCC report in 2018, and you can see the Keeling curve of just CO2 going up and up and up. And then in the fall of 2018, we started organizing the first Fridays for Future school strikes in Germany. I was just kind of by accident put into a WhatsApp group because somebody knew that I was kind of thinking about this topic a lot. And then 2 days later, I organized my first school strike. It was kind of the first march I ever organized. I'd been like to a few demonstrations before, but yeah, at that point, I kind of realized that while it's kind of hard to change things alone, you're hardly ever alone because there's so many other people who are like having the same worries and who were feeling the same anger towards the government as I was. And that was really, really powerful for me to see that when a bunch of people get together, then you can collectively build pressure and kind of be stronger together. And so yeah, since then I've kind of just not stopped organizing.
Great. Now it's hard to believe that the first Fridays for Future strike was now almost 4 years ago. We're in 2022. We've heard a bit about you two. Let's move on to policy and governments in your respective countries. Lauren, a lot of Europeans and Americans are still waiting for the US to pass major climate legislation in the form of the Build Back Better bill. What is the outlook for Democrats actually getting that done? And what is Sunrise doing to help them get it done?
Yeah, that's on the hearts and minds of, I think, everyone around me and I think around the world in a lot of ways, since the US is such a massive emitter and has huge global responsibility, that this bill is not just an issue for the US. It's really about like finally tackling the climate crisis in a major way globally. So yeah, the stakes feel really high. I actually a little tired, unfortunately, for this panel because I woke up at 6 a.m. to go down to the White House for an action that was called Biden Get a Spine or Give Biden a Spine, something trying to instill him with some courage. And yeah, it's a really beautiful showing of people. But yeah, put simply, like, we elected Biden in like the largest popular vote in nearly 100 years. And he had a really clear mandate to tackle the climate crisis, create all these good jobs, give people healthcare and childcare. It's what like the majority of people in the US actually want and need. And the House passed this bill. It took a really long time for them to even do that, and a lot of organizing and activism to even get that through. And that passed in October, I think, November. They're all blurring together. And now it's just stuck in the Senate, really because of Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who personally profits off of fossil fuels, his family and himself. And is a huge recipient of fossil fuel donations and meets with fossil fuel industry lobbyists and executives every week. And so he is the chair of an energy committee, and he is single-handedly holding up this bill as the 50th vote in the Senate. So just for context, if people don't know all the US minutiae of politics, but so movements, Sunrise, broader social movements in the US are still making sure that Biden knows that he cannot be let off the hook. This is what we elected him on, and the stakes could not be higher, especially going into, well, we are in this election year now. And so people are feeling really disillusioned. His approval ratings are lower than ever. And we both need the tangible results, but also he needs to deliver to have any chance of keeping this Democratic majority. So we're trying to make that case really clear through keeping up with actions and keeping the pressure up, because as soon as we step back, then Joe Manchin's power increases even more. So we're keeping the fight up, hopefully until the bill passes.
I'll have more questions for you on your tactics in that campaign later, Lauren. Helena, before I ask you about the new German government, I know you have links to the US as well. If you had a quick response to what Lauren said or what you think about what's going on in Washington right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of parallels to the German government, right? Because there were all these big promises made by Biden that he would rejoin the Paris Agreement, which he has done. But then the point with the Paris Agreement is that you then have to fulfill the promises that you make within that agreement to reduce emissions. And the problem, so the thing with the climate crisis is that it's in the end of the day, the promises don't count if we're not actually realistically reducing emissions. And he's been in office for a year, and a lot of those promises have stayed unfulfilled. And there's been new oil and gas permits given to industry, and there's been a lack of real tangible action, and that's obviously quite disappointing for me to see as well, because at the end of the day, we can see the climate crisis escalating all around us, right? There are fires, there are floods, there are people suffering at the moment all over the world already, and like losing their homes and their livelihoods because of the failure of the most like rich Western global North countries that are emitting so much more per person than like a bunch of other countries because of their failure to act. And that's really, really hard to watch, because we've done so much right as movements over the last years. There are such overwhelming majorities in the US for the Green New Deal, but also for Build Back Better, and that's the same in Germany. Like a huge majority of people voted because of on climate, like that was their most like important topic for them. And there's huge majorities of people who are really, really worried about the climate crisis. And so at the moment, the problem is not that there is definitely enough people on our side. The problem is that there's a lack of political will to actually implement the action.
Got it. Let's switch our attention back to Germany and Berlin. Germany, of course, also has a new government, and this new government has more ambitious climate goals, but the economy and climate minister, Robert Habeck, has already admitted Germany will probably miss its climate targets for 2022 and probably 2023 as well. So how optimistic are
that we will be able to put enough pressure on this new government to ramp up the action that is happening? Because so one of the good things that has happened is that we have a new government. We have broken the blockade of the conservative government that has been over the last 16 years, and there's now huge possibilities for a lot more to happen. And at the end of the day, it's our job as movements, but it's also the job of people who are not in movements yet to take to the streets, to put pressure on the government every single day and remind them what they were voted for. And we honestly have no other choice than to do that and to do really, really, really good at our job, because this is like, these next 4 years are so essential. This is like the last government that can really put us on track to stay in line with 1.5 degrees and stay in line with the Paris Agreement. Yeah, we have a lot of work to do in the next years, and I'm really excited to do it. Yeah, so what we cannot have is see is people giving up before they've started. So this, Robert Habeck's announcement was quite disconcerting for me, because when we see that emissions aren't going down, then that's the point where you have to put in plans to immediately lower emissions, instead of giving up before you've even started. And so yeah, we'll see.
We will see. I'm hearing a lot of justified climate protection success. I mean, how do you react to the fact that this is much better than before? We want to say something positive about it, but it's not enough for 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. Lauren,
I
how do you feel about
think
that?
people really respect and resonate with the truth, and that's like what we bring every day as young people. We're not bought out by fossil fuel companies. We're just in this because we understand the stakes for our lives and for like global solidarity in our communities. And so I think when we say like, this is a huge change and in the right direction, it's really great to not have, an actively violent white supremacist in office. That is true. And someone who actually like acknowledges the climate crisis and is putting, pretty good staff in office to try to have like a government response. I think these are all things that we want to acknowledge and celebrate especially the work of the movement to actually like organize young people to have historic youth voter turnout and all of these things. Like, it didn't happen by chance. It was so much hard work over the past like 4 years of like having resistance to the Trump administration, but also really like committed organizing to vote him out. And so yeah, I think we celebrate the wins we get that largely came from organizing, while always saying that if you actually like look at the scale of the crisis that we're up against, we have so much farther to go. And so yeah, politicians will always, say, we did our job, and try to go home and celebrate and show what they've done. And we always need to recognize that and push for more and use those victories to ask for more, because those demands are not at all radical when we're actually looking at like the scale and scope of the crisis that we face. So that's basically what we try to do. That was kind of the origin of Sunrise, was in, well, a little after like we really got off the ground, but our first major action that kind of galvanized national and even international attention was when we sat in Nancy Pelosi's office, the soon-to-be Speaker of the House and the Democratic Party, and saying, Democrats just took back the majority in the House. That's great, but we expect so much more of you than a committee to start thinking about the climate crisis. You're now in power. So yeah, I think that's kind of our orientation to this current Democratic administration.
And Helena, how about you at Fridays for Future? Partial success, positive messaging, what's your approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we kind of return to our origins, which is unite behind the science. And that means looking at the actual progress we're making, and the problem, and of course, more is happening now than has ever happened before. And that's important to recognize. And it's important to recognize that we, the people, have garnered those successes. But at the same time, more than ever before is not enough and it's not what is necessary to combat the situation that we are in. And I think we follow a very similar strategy to Sunrise there, and just try to be honest about that as much as possible, to recognize how far we've come, but to also recognize that we have so much further to go, and that we have ever less time in order to walk that path.
Brief housekeeping note, there's some discussion in the chat about where you can put your questions. You can put them in the Q&A, put them in the chat. We will get to them. We want to do another 20 minutes of my prepared questions before we go to the audience Q&A, because we definitely want to use the hive mind, the Schwarmintelligenz. So we do want to hear from you. Please ask your questions. Tactics. This is something we've been sort of dancing around, but I think it's time to get into this. Lauren, you mentioned the Nancy Pelosi sit-in, and that's just one of a variety of tactics that you guys have used. You had a hunger strike in front of the White House to support the Build Back Better bill. I think you also did a sit-in at Mitch McConnell's office in Kentucky, which warms my heart. And you also do more traditional political work, like trying to elect supportive Congress people. So what's your core approach to activism and campaigning, and how might that change this year?
So I think there's kind of two things that really ground Sunrise's theory of change around tactics and political strategy. So we're always targeting the public. So we always want to be growing the movement, because our theory is that if you look at all kind of great historical examples of societal transformation, it always came from just social movements forcing the change from the outside, whether that be work stoppages and strikes, or just sustained nonviolent action of social movements, collectively forcing political change. And so we know that there's, just like Helena said, so many people already on our side, but we actually need to activate them and make them feel their power and know where to direct that. And so that's sort of been Sunrise's orientation, is that we have a lot of people on our side. We need to activate them and bring them into the movement, always be growing the movement, and that's how we'll have enough power over time, and not that much time. We have a short amount of time to grow this massive social movement and force this political change through. And so I think with the Build Back Better example, it shows that we haven't fully, the pandemic suppressed this, obviously, but we haven't built enough political power from the outside to actually force the change through. So we need to keep doing that. But yeah, Sunrise, that's sort of the underlying approach. But then tactically, we think we need people power, which I was just referring to, political power. So we actually need our champions in the halls of power, in Congress, in the White House, at all levels of government. And that's why we do electoral work. And we need to kind of change the dominant political common sense of what is possible by realigning a lot of institutions in the country and around the world. Really, this intellectual concept of what we need, and sort of the broader nonprofit sphere. So rather than this sort of market-based approach or something like that, we actually need to bring people over to saying we need economy-wide change. We need public investments. We need equity. We need organized labor. These are all societal political shifts, and Sunrise tries to change politics towards that direction through direct action and electoral work and organizing and movement building. So that was a lot in a short amount of time, ideologically and such. But I'm sure Helena has things to add, because we also talked separate from this panel, and there's a lot of synergy. So.
Yeah, it was a lot in a good way. And I'm sure Helena, you can respond in a second, because I want to hear you talk to each other about tactics you can learn from, or tactics that the other person could pick up. But Helena, Fridays for Future is also a very versatile group. You've done massive street marches. I was there in 2019. Then you did virtual socially distanced strikes during the pandemic. You've also put out scientific reports with the Wuppertal Institute, lobbying officials. What's your core approach, and how does it differ or resemble what Lauren was saying?
Yeah, I think fundamentally the idea is that we need to make as many people who are on our side already visible as possible, and we need to put them in places where we can exert pressure in order to change the political and economic systems in which we are operating. Because the thing is that these that the climate crisis is happening on such a large scope that the idea that like we through individual action can like change this scope is quite absurd, because at the end of the day, those actions only add up. But when we change the systems that we are like moving within, then that multiplies the amount of action that can flow from that. So we are mostly focused on exerting public pressure on governments, and that's on every kind of level. We have like hundreds of local groups similar to the Sunrise Hubs, where we try and, as much as possible, take part in like local and regional political development, and as well as these huge climate strike days. I think that's the 10th global climate strike coming up in March here in Germany, and all over the world again, where we just try and show on the streets how many people not only are ready for change, but want change desperately. And I think at the end of the day, we hear a lot about like climate, like tipping points in like climate systems, and they are very much there and they are very scary. But at the same time, we can also reach tipping points in our social systems, where at a certain point when we've marched enough times and we've kind of been there enough times, then suddenly a lot will be possible that didn't seem so before. I think one of the best examples of that in Germany is that we actually have a pretty safe exit out of coal power by 2030, which 3 years ago when we started Fridays for Future strikes, the coal commission was meeting, and they chose to not exit coal till 2038, and within 3 years we have kind of moved that forward by 8 years, something that nobody was agreeing to only 3 years ago. And I think there's so many areas where we are just at the brink of that happening. I think also that our role is changing obviously now, because there's no climate opposition that we can really trust in the parliament right now, with left party electing a gas friend into the climate Ausschuss in the parliament. It's our job now as civil society to not only exert pressure from outside, but to also be more ingrained in like parliamentary processes, because there's no opposition that will demand more ambitious climate politics that we can trust in parliament. So I think that's something that will obviously, that's kind of, we're getting used to, and there's even bigger responsibility that kind of falls to us.
Reaching the beneficial tipping points. I like that idea. Lauren, any reaction from you? Any tactics there that you could see American activists adopting?
I think there's a lot of similarities, honestly. Yeah, I think what I think is really unique and powerful about the Fridays for Future strike movement is the tactic is kind of the same thing, like time and time again. And so you're trying to like build numbers and demonstrate the strength over time, and kind of like implicitly also instill sort of like a threat of like stopping business as usual. And I think strikes are just such a powerful tactic that we've tried to incorporate in different ways. But I think a big difference in the US is like around actually like the cultural orientation to strikes is very different here, and it's just sort of an uphill battle because we don't have kind of the fabric of like organized labor and organized student unions and things like that I think are kind of embedded easier ways to kind of like catalyze a strike movement, and so it's been a little bit difficult to kind of embrace it to the same extent, but we definitely see the value and have tried to incorporate that as like a big tactic that we're building towards. But it takes a lot more like political education and radicalization and like kind of organizing as a precursor to even considering people striking.
Yeah. Interesting.
I'm really just waiting.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Helena,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I'm really just, I think the other way around, I would love to occupy some offices of German politicians sometime soon. I think, I don't want to say too much, but I think that would be a really exciting tactic for us to try here as well, where we can probably learn a lot from each other.
All right, sharing tactics. 10 more minutes until the audience questions. Let's move a bit beyond climate itself. Lauren, Sunrise has been sort of expanding its activism to other issues like immigration, the minimum wage, police reform. Does this make your climate activism more effective, or do you think it gives critics more avenues to attack?
I think 100% more effective. I don't think, yeah, the notion that like climate is separate from any of these other issues you just mentioned is false. And in fact, you know, we know that the climate crisis and pollution from burning fossil fuels and a lot of other, heavy industry and pollutants like will always affect like first and worst people that hold more marginalized identities, immigrants, young people, Black and brown people. And so, yeah, when we're fighting for climate justice, we also need to be fighting for broader economic justice, racial justice, immigration justice. And I think that's both like a deep value statement of just saying like these things are inextricable. And in order to address one, you need to be addressing the other, but also from a strategy perspective, the people at the top, you know, elites, fossil fuel billionaires, politicians, always have tried to maintain their power by dividing everyone else along race, class, religion, etc. And the only way that we're going to build enough power to actually win our collective agenda is by uniting. And so that means actually uniting across this sort of popular, populist, multiracial, cross-class movement, addressing broader societal change, of which climate kind of undergirds all of them. And so I think, yeah, this is kind of what distinguishes sort of the like left, more progressive climate movement in the US from like the mainstream liberal orientation to climate, and we've been moving the liberal climate position farther, more progressive. That's kind of been the role of our social movement is as we are decarbonizing, we have the opportunity to actually restructure the economy to lift up people who've been left behind and who are more vulnerable to the climate crisis. So we've been saying like the Green New Deal is all about providing everyone a good paying job with the union and healthcare, and making sure that equity is, you know, embedded throughout everything. So there's actually like more public investment towards communities that are more vulnerable to the climate crisis or need more investment because they haven't had any public investment for 30 years or something like that. So we're not just thinking about it in terms of we need to draw down emissions and that's it, because if we do that, we will actually just further advance, you know, white and wealthy people. We actually need to think about the climate crisis like hand in hand with everything else. Yeah.
Do you think about the climate crisis and climate justice the same way? I know Fridays for Future has called the climate crisis racist, sexist, and elitist.
Yeah, I think what's really important is that we recognize that crises do not affect everyone equally. So when I was living in the US and we had a hurricane and a power outage, the people who got power first, like back first, were the people who lived like in the center of town, and the people who lived more on the outskirts of town where housing prices were cheaper and where like less, I guess, well-off families lived, got power maybe 3 weeks back after us. And I think that was the first time I realized that although we are like all subject to the same crises, the way they affect us are not the same. And I think it's been extremely visible through the pandemic that when we see who is like feeling the brunt of the effects, we are looking at like single parents, we are looking at like people who don't have huge houses that they can quarantine in. We are looking at again and again at the people who are already like most like suffering most through the systems of oppression are suffer even more when we add layers of crises. And so when we look at climate crisis solutions, we should obviously have that like not forget that, because when we're looking at who should bear the financial cost of the climate crisis, or how we create policy that not only reduces emission but also creates resilience, because even if we reduce emissions as like to the amount necessary, the next like decades are going to be really hard on us, and there's going to still be a lot of like natural disasters and catastrophe and heat waves, and like we will have to deal with a lot of crises in the next decades. And so when we are looking at what policy are we implementing and what climate solutions do we have, we need to keep that in mind. How can we support the people who will suffer the most under these crises in the next decades?
Very well said. I see the audience questions piling up, so I think I'm just going to ask you guys one more before we bring in the audience and make this more interactive. The theme of the last question was basically climate justice, and that was mainly justice for disadvantaged groups today, frontline communities, whatever phrasing you want to use. How do you guys think about intergenerational climate justice and international climate justice? I'm thinking here of the discussions at COP26 and at the forthcoming COP27 about loss and damage, which is essentially climate reparations. Lauren, what does the US need to do? What does Germany need to do? Loss and damage? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think a huge contribution, or like something that Sunrise has been trying to make clear and like push the Democratic Party and thinking around climate, is that sure, there's the international agreements and science of where we need to be globally by 2050 to avert the worst of the climate crisis, or say under 1.5. But that doesn't mean that that is the US standard of what we need to get to by 2050 or 2030. Because we've been such massive emitters, the largest over time, because we have access to a lot of technology and financial resources, and we have a responsibility on both of those fronts to move so much faster than many other countries that also are party to the agreement, in order to have any chance of meeting that goal. So the Green New Deal said we need to reach zero emissions in the next decade to have even a 50% shot of meeting the Paris Agreement. And now Biden is saying we need to reduce emissions 50% by 2030 rather than to zero by 2030. And so that's not in line with actually like both the US global responsibility and just the basic science of how much we've emitted and how much we continue to emit. So we've been really trying to clarify like the US's role based on international climate justice and based on science of emissions, and kind of trying to inject that into all kind of high level political decision making and goal setting in the US, and kind of the broader narrative of our responsibility. And then of course, in terms of intergenerational, I think we're not the first people to, be out in the streets or like be taking sacrifices as young people on climate. We like stand on the shoulders of such courageous and powerful social movements that we've learned so much from and that have kind of laid the groundwork for us. So that's kind of looking retroactively. And then of course we stand with other movements. Particularly, I think we have a lot to learn from indigenous movements in here and globally, to really have that future generation kind of framework, and think about, yes, we're telling our stories as young people and fighting for our futures, but we're actually fighting for the future of our futures, and recognizing all of the previous generations that laid the groundwork for our organizing as well.
Well said. Helena, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to that, and then we'll bring in the audience. I think Helena may be having connection issues. At least she's frozen on my screen, but I'm sure she'll be back in just a second.
I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Oh, now you're coming in, speaking very
back.
fast.
Yeah,
you're back. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, my internet is.
No, you're all right. Those red bars. Quick response on climate justice and loss and damage.
Yeah. So I think Germany is quite a similar situation because we are historically, so if you look at all the emissions over the last like 100, 150 years, then Germany is the fourth largest historical emitter, which obviously means that we bear a huge responsibility, especially for the people, for people like feeling the worst of the climate crisis effects right now, whose countries did not contribute the way that Germany or the US, for instance, has. And so that's obviously a place where loss and damage financing, where countries that maybe are not in the same economic situation that Germany is in, but who are like really suffering at the moment because of the climate crisis, have like financial resources not only to to adapt, but also to kind of to build resilience against future climate effects. And so obviously I think we're looking at that a lot, but also recognizing that everything, all the progress that we don't make right now is going to make everything for future generations a lot harder. So we recently went to court against the German government and won, because exactly around this topic, where the reduction plans of governments made that so that we need to, if we don't, because there was so little plans to reduce emissions until 2030, that meant that after 2030, the drasticness of action that would then have to be taken would really dramatically influence life for a lot of people, and basically change would happen at such a speed that it would obviously be a lot harder for us. And so that was the German federal court said we were right, and that it was unfair for that emissions weren't being reduced right now. And I think that's I think that we have so many stories to tell about injustice but also justice surrounding the climate crisis. And I think it's our job as movements to continue to tell the stories of what's going wrong, but also how it could be going right, because we have so much still to save, and we have so much still to win. And I think it's at a time where so many people are ready to give up hope and to say it's, after not acting for decades, now saying it's too late. It's our role to continue telling stories of transformation and to continue telling stories of a better future, because that's what we're fighting for, and it's still possible. And because otherwise, then otherwise why would we continue taking to the streets if there's not so much still for us to save and fight for?
Lots of interesting points there. Yeah, the legal avenues for climate action are very promising, and you made a good point about it's not the emissions from today or the past few years from China or India that are responsible for climate impacts now. It's the cumulative emissions, mostly from countries in the North Atlantic. So let's bring in our audience now. Here's how we've got a bunch of questions in the chat. Here's how I want to do it. We'll take two at a time, and then either of you can just pick which one you want to respond to, whoever wants to go first. So one question from Anna about the 22nd Heinrich-Böll Foundation Foreign Policy Conference last week. Anna attended and had the feeling that the 1.5 degree goal was out of sight and unrealistic for most participants. Do you think 1.5 is out of sight, or can your movements achieve the necessary transformation? The second question is from Ella. She asks, how can the transatlantic exchange between Sunrise Movement and Fridays for Future help the other organization reach its respective goals?
I could just start. I think that we owe it to the people suffering and who will suffer in future to not give up on 1.5. And even we can have a scientific discussion about the likelihood of stabilizing global temperatures below 1.5 degrees in the next 100 years. But honestly, that doesn't make a difference to what we need to do right at this moment, which is reduce emissions drastically, and at best by over 8% every year. And at the end of the day, now after because the people who often say 1.5 is no longer reach are the people who in the last decades have profited from the climate crisis, and who have in the last decades failed to act, and who have now kind of, from denying the climate crisis as a problem, have switched over to denying that we can still solve it. And so I think it's our job as movements to not give up before it's utterly too late, which at the moment it is not right now. And every little 10th of a degree less that the climate warms is less suffering for people all over the world, and is less suffering for young people in the future. So at the end of the day, I see it as our responsibility to keep hope alive for as long as possible, and to keep action alive as long as possible, because that is in the end what we need.
Well, yeah, well said. I can address the other question. Agree with everything Helena said. Yeah, I mean, I think right now we're at a pretty scary inflection point, both in terms of obviously the trajectory of the climate crisis worsening every day, and just feeling so deeply like fear and the impacts of that, both in our communities and around the world. And at the same time, seeing the rise of like the consolidation of power of the far right and kind of global fascism and white supremacy and xenophobia and anti-immigrant policies. And so I think I feel a lot of like hope and solidarity of like knowing that there's also young people fighting to protect democracy in Germany, fighting to protect, kind of just progressive values of having immigrants be welcome in your country, and fighting against the violence and hatred that's really building on the other side. And so I think we have a lot to learn and a lot to gain from kind of feeling the strength of a global resistance and like building global power on the left, and not just seeing it as like young people in the US fighting for democracy for the US, because fundamentally democracy for the US, it has global repercussions, as we know, as does, you know, having democracy in Europe and respective countries in Europe as well. And of course, with the climate crisis, as we've already seen, there's going to be millions of more climate refugees. And I think we have a lot to learn of really taking that head on in our organizing and our activism and our policies that we're fighting for, especially as the right is using the climate crisis and weaponizing it against refugees and against immigrants. And I think that's a very shared policy that we need to embrace as progressive movements across the world, of understanding the climate crisis and making sure that means more inclusion of immigrants and refugees rather than less.
There's actually a perfect follow-up question for this. Michael in the audience, I don't know if you could see the future, but Lauren, right back to you on the same topic. Michael asked, given the merging of corporate power and police power in the US, as we've seen with protests against Line 3 in Minnesota, as well as the ongoing prosecution of Stephen Donziger, is there any way to do direct action safely in the US anymore? Basically, do you feel free and safe as an activist in America?
I think safety is definitely different for, you know, everyone, depending on the identities that you hold. So like as a white person in the US, I think I probably feel safer around at actions where there are police than, you know, one of my comrades who is Black or brown or not a citizen. So yeah, I think it definitely depends on, you know, gender identity, racial identity, etc. I think that being said, the increasing militarism in general is definitely scary. And also, I think if we take a step back and kind of let their fear win, that means that they're gaining more power. And so, yeah, I think it's a really crazy time to be like a young person trying to just like do what's right and just try to like be in community and like leading, putting ourselves out there and like speaking truth to power and leading in this way, because the stakes of like the reality of the polarization in this country and kind of the consolidation of just the police state and what that means, like military industrial complex merging with police forces, really trying to protect fossil fuels at all costs. That's into direct conflict with what we're trying to do, which is have a just transition that defunds the police and actually refunds and allocates that money to our communities and towards green jobs and all of these things. So I think we can't let their consolidation of power and fear like intimidate us, because we've seen this in the past. We saw this in the civil rights movement in this country. We see this with all forms of indigenous resistance. And yeah, it's scary, but we have to kind of stay together and be like really support each other in this time, I think is the most important thing.
Definitely. Well said, Lauren. The stakes are certainly high at the moment. We have 10 more minutes now, 9 more minutes, and I want to try to get to the last 5 questions from the audience. So we're going to go through them a little bit quicker. We have a question, a very meta question from Anna to Helena. Helena, how would you describe the relationship between the German climate movement and the Green Party now that the Greens are part of government? How is that relationship changing?
Yeah, so I was on like a lot of panels last year before the election with members of the Green Party. And every single time I wouldn't even say anything. And the Green Party representative would like on their own say something in like the line of, oh yeah, but Helena's here. And I know she'll say we're not doing enough, but we're trying really hard and we're doing more than everyone else. And I feel like that summarizes the relationship quite well, because obviously the Green Party has been talking about the climate crisis longer than any other party in Germany and has the most ambitious plans, and that's really cool to see. But at the same time, there's like, we're not going to let them rest on that. And especially now that they're in government, there's a lot of new responsibilities that they hold and that we will keep reminding them of. I think that as they obviously are in a governmental role now, there's going to be less, like especially when it comes to like oppositional work, as I had mentioned earlier, in like the parliamentary process, that is a role that like a lot more falls to social movements and less to the Green Party. So there will be like obviously less collaboration on that. And at the same time, the Green Party has also won a lot, like a lot of seats in parliaments, and has like politically won a lot over the last years, due to also to the success of movements. And because movements changed the conversation on the climate crisis, the Green Party profited from that. And that's like, I think, important to recognize. And that also means they have like a lot of responsibility towards movements and towards that success that like I guess we have helped build, even though we have like not directly endorsed the Green Party in any way. Yeah, I think that's kind of the situation where we're at. I think I also just quickly want to add to what Lauren said earlier. I think that you are seeing like in Germany, for instance, in North Rhine-Westphalia, there's a new policing law that was passed at the end of last year in reaction to a lot of the anti-coal protests that happened there, where coal infrastructure was blocked. And now that there's a lot of laws that have like quite specifically targeted Ende Gelände as one of the groups that was doing that action, and like really cut into the right to protest fundamentally. And I think while that's really quite worrying to see and has been absolutely devastating for the people in North Rhine-Westphalia and who have been protesting against this law, and it sadly got passed anyway, I think at the same time, when people in power get nervous and they start having to consolidate power in order to fight against us, that is also a sign that we're winning, that we are making them nervous. And I think that if anything, then we can hold on to that when those are the last measures that they can pick up in order to fight against our protest, we are winning. And I think that is what we need to keep doing in the next years, even though that will obviously be harder with the laws that are infringing on a right to protest. I think that's also a time where we need to recognize the privileged situation we are in still in the US and Europe, where we largely do have the right to protest, whereas in a lot of other countries, the young people who are school striking have been arrested, have been for simply standing on a street with a sign. And I think that's one of the fundamental places where we can see how entrenched democratic rights and freedoms are with us fighting the climate crisis, and remembering that these problems are so fundamentally intertwined and cannot be separated is, I think, for us also important to remember and to also make visible.
There's not much more time to reduce emissions fast enough to keep warming to 1.5, and there's not much time left in our discussion today. So we're going to go with quick 1-minute responses for the final questions. I'm going to give you guys 2 at once. One from Tim. How are your conversations with older politicians regarding the intergenerational justice aspect when it comes to climate change? And from Sharai, what about global engagement? We know that climate does not know borders. How do you plan to influence the big polluters if they are based in countries that aren't democratic? Is it through the UN? Either one of you can start.
I don't know if you have something on your mind, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can start on the global aspect. The good
Yeah.
thing is that there are climate activists and there are young people and there are movements all over the world. So it's not like we need to, Lauren and I need to do all this work, just the 2 of us. There are people everywhere who are rising up and who are also rising up in less democratic countries. I think so, and that is what at the end gives me the energy to keep going, because I know that there are young people and such inspiring young people everywhere. And at the same time, as I think I said earlier, when influential countries like the US and Germany start acting and actually fulfilling their part and their role in reducing emissions, then that's also when we're going to see a lot of other countries, I think, following and joining the momentum of actually reducing emissions. But like Germany cannot point to other countries and tell them to do more when we are not even reducing our own emissions fast enough.
Lauren, do you have any response to the question about older politicians? I'm 29 and now I'm feeling like the old person in this discussion. What do you think?
No, yeah, I mean, I think that everyone has a stake in the climate crisis. So, you know, even older people themselves, but also because they probably have someone they love in their life who is younger and will have to live on this planet, yeah, amongst climate catastrophe for more years. And so I don't think it's just like age-based that defines, you know, ambition or commitment to tackling the climate crisis. I think we see people like Senator Bernie Sanders or Senator Ed Markey in the US, who are 2 really, really strong climate leaders who are both definitely on the older side. And then, you know, there's someone like Joe Biden, who is the same age, but doesn't carry the same kind of thorough ambition behind the climate crisis. But of course he has, you know, people in his own family. And so I think sometimes it's useful for young people with our moral authority to go to him and say, like, who are you fighting for? Like, who are you, what world are you leaving behind for people that you love, like your grandchildren, your children, and kind of force them into understanding the crisis that they might not live with every day like we do, thinking about our futures, but how can we bring that same kind of moral urgency into their brains and into like their political decision making. So that's sort of the route we've taken. We did that again within the Pelosi sit-in. Like she's old, she's wealthy, she's been in power for a while, but we know she cares about California. Well, we don't. We in theory think she cares about her constituents, her state of California. We in theory think she cares about her grandchildren. So how can we bring the stakes of the crisis and ask her who she's fighting for?
She's certainly been around a long time, and I think she's running again to remain Speaker of the House. We're running out of time, so I'm going to give you both a minute to make a sort of closing statement, and maybe you can take our last audience question into your final statement. It comes from Christopher, who says, climate solutions are often framed as an issue of personal sacrifice. How much do we need to pay, or what behavior do we need to change? What are your strategic approaches to overcome that framing in the public discussion? And then the last word for the audience before we wrap here. Helena?
Yeah, I think we combat this hurtful narrative of us having to solve this crisis individually, which can also be really quite depressing, because when we realize that even if we buy bamboo toothbrushes, the climate crisis is still getting worse. I think we combat that by creating community, by making clear that we are not in this alone, but we are all in this together, and that that we are part of systems that are larger than ourselves, and naming the people who got us into the situation, which is the politicians of the last decades, which is the company executive of the last decades, which is the people who continued to profit off of fossil fuels and profit off the climate crisis, even though they knew what the effects were, and to name those people as being at fault. And I think that is the way that we together can build pressure and can change the systems we are in, because they're not made of stone. They are changeable, like, because we are part of these systems. And I think that's really important. I think change is not linear, right? Just as systems do not move in linear fashion, things will not always keep going at the same speed or in the same way, because like we are unpredictable as the human factor. And I think that's why I like keep recalling into like try and keep emphasizing that we have these climate models which are very exact, where the science is very good, but there's a huge room of error within them, because it's so unclear what humanity will do in the next decades and how that will influence the reduction of emissions. And I think kind of as a last word to people watching, or should I?
No, please, last word.
I think yeah. We've talked a lot about movements and about young people, but like we are not going to solve this problem if more people don't keep joining us. And you don't need to be in this for like 3 years or longer, like Lauren and I have. Like all you need to do to become active is the will to change the systems we are in, and is anger at our governments, and like that's it. That's all you need to get started, and then there will be a place like in movements and in your community and in politics where we need every single person to start calling for change. And so if there's like, yeah, if there's anyone here who's like feeling, who was seeing this panel and is like thinking about what they can do, there's like so many local groups probably everywhere where you can just come by and start becoming active, because there's a lot of like, the only reason I think I am so like energetic, even though the climate crisis is really depressing, is because I see all these people around me who are becoming active, and I think that can be really helpful when we feel like things aren't going well.
That was a very eloquent call to action, and you also a hopeful call to action. You sort of addressed the question from Ella about where you find the hope to keep going. Lauren, I'd like to give back to you. 30 seconds, final word to the audience in Germany and the US.
Cool. Just to address the sacrifice thing really quickly, I think this is like why the Green New Deal is like, we were like, this is the solution to the climate crisis. All of this like personal sacrifice, you're going to lose your job, you need to give up meat, all of these things are not right. We actually have so much to gain. The world can be so much better. Our lives can be so much better. We can have clean air, we can have a good job, we can have union protections, all of these things through tackling the climate crisis. So that gives me hope, and I think it's a really like powerful and necessary political strategy to win as well, to bring more people in. So just to say that, and I love this conversation topic. And yeah, and then the closing words, similar to Helena, I think yeah, it's just such a scary time right now, and I like wake up every day with feeling that dread, and then I'm like, okay, how am I going to get through the dread? I need to get out of bed. And then I think about how everyone that's, you know, trying to keep us small and keep us scared would love for me to stay in that feeling of dread and not get out of bed. That would be like their biggest victory. And so I don't want to give them that because they are inciting violence and hatred and yeah, killing people like all around the world, and we can't have that. So I think that's something, just like, you know, there's probably a more hopeful way to have an inspiring message of what the world could look like. And on a like true note, like it's a really scary time. And that's sort of how I make sense of it, is like, I know the far right in the US and really globally is getting super organized, and it's terrifying. And we need to like hold on to the power we have and not let them win by keeping us feeling small and week. So yeah, join our movements.
That's great final words, inspiring. Let's keep fighting. We're all out of time. That's it from me. I'd like to thank Lauren and Helena for joining us, and also thank all the organizers of the Böll-Stiftung for putting this together. I'll now hand back to Nora for a final word and to close the session.
Thank you so much to Lauren, Helena, and Noah for these great conversations. Thank you for sharing your motivation, your experience, and also your knowledge. I think it was highly appreciated. We had lots of questions from the audience. Keep up the good work, and please keep in touch and be safe. To the audience, we would love to improve our work and would appreciate if you take a minute or two to answer a few questions in the survey we are going to show right now. Thank you so much for joining, for taking the time. Please stay safe and stay green. Bye and see you soon. Bye. And thanks for taking the survey.